First of all, a big welcome from the Trust, but also from the Psychosynthesis Academy. And my counterpart, Eric, will also be joining us briefly, but I know that his Wi-Fi isn't that brilliant at the moment. So what we're doing tonight is we're joined by, wonderfully, by Thomas Yeomans, Piero Ferrucci, Andrea Bocconi, and Diana Whitmore. And the point of tonight is to really talk through what it's been like for them on the journey of the last 40, 50 years being involved in psychosynthesis.
Oh my God. Okay.
I'm sorry, Diana, I had to.
No, you always do, Kim.
Diana, my first question I'd love you to start is right in the early beginnings. If you can tell us a little bit about how you found psychosynthesis, you know, what those connections were, and also in coming together with your colleagues and friends.
Right. Okay. Hello, everyone. I see all the greetings that are flying around the room in the chat box, which is wonderful, because there's an enormous audience here of people who have been on the road of psychosynthesis for a very long time. So we've probably been on the road just a little bit longer than others, I would guess, probably because we're just a little bit older than others as well. But I would like to put my beginning with psychosynthesis in a context, but I think it's true for all four of us that in the early 70s, when most of us discovered psychosynthesis, there was really I would call it a collective superconscious wave that was happening all over the world, which you could call it the human potential movement. There was the Esalen Institute in California that was pioneering the exploration of human potential. And as a young woman, I could feel it in the air. I didn't know what it was. I knew there was something important happening. I wanted to be a part of it, but I didn't know what it was, and I didn't know how to be a part of it. And that took me to the Esalen Institute for 4 years, which was kind of in California, the mother of all the human potential movement. And it was a time I can share with you that was so rich with hope. You know, we all could feel that we could make a better world. It was possible. So there was youthful idealism, there was hope, there was kind of passion and positivity for something that was in the collective that we could call human potential or personal development or psychospiritual development. So I started my journey at Esalen, and I trained as a Gestalt therapist there. And psychosynthesis wasn't really known at Esalen. They talked about this will stuff where you threw matchsticks on a table and you picked them up in order to train your will. And when I heard about that at Esalen, I thought, I don't want to do that. What is that? Picking matches up to train your will. Of course, I understand it now, but I didn't back then. So I kind of stumbled upon psychosynthesis when I left Esalen and went to graduate school in Santa Barbara. And Tom Yeomans here, sitting with us all, was my first psychosynthesis teacher. I think it was about 74. And I discovered psychosynthesis then. And to make a long story short, I took my first trip to Europe and my first trip to Italy. My background is Italian. So I wanted to go to my mother country and meet this wise old man and see what he was all about. But I was really arrogant and a very hardcore Gestalt therapist. And you know, catharsis was where it was at. And if people could cathart, they were growing. And that was some of the distortions that happened in those days. So I wasn't expecting much when I went to Italy to see Assagioli. And the first time I went, I can only share with you, and the memory is as strong and bright right now as it was all those years ago, was I walked into his office and the room was full of light. I don't know any other way to describe it. And maybe I'm going to cry right now, but I'll try not to. It was so beautiful. And I knew in an instant that I'd come home, that this was it for me. I knew this was my life's work. And I also had an awareness that my personal life was over, which it was, because of the way that I threw myself into psychosynthesis, and I'm still throwing myself into psychosynthesis in various ways. So that was the beginning for me. And I got to spend a lot of time with Roberto, because his protege, Piero Ferrucci, was away for the summer. So I spent a whole summer doing Piero's job with Assagioli, which was spending about 4 or 5 hours a day with him, meditating with him, just basking in his presence. And, you know, it reminded me of darshan, sitting darshan with the master. Although Assagioli would not like me to be saying this, because as you probably all know, he was anti-gurus. He thought gurus were old age. It wasn't a part of the new age, and that the soul was the guru today, each of our souls. But it was very much like being with the most conscious person I've ever been with. Maybe I could put it that way. And it was a wonderful time, and it touched me so deeply that I came back and took over the Psychosynthesis Trust, which most of you know. And I was determined, because I was with Assagioli when he died, and that touched me very deeply. I was determined to put psychosynthesis in the UK on the map. So it took 6 years for counseling accreditation, took another 6 years for psychotherapy accreditation for the organization, and it took another 6 years to get university validation. But I got us there. And that was the moment, the most fulfilling moment for me, that we finally got there. And it wasn't without a long, arduous journey, I assure you. And then, Kim?
Yeah, Diana, I'm going to bring us back to, I'm going to bring us back to the beginning and to.
Oh, I forgot. Well, that was the beginning, sort of.
It is. No, it is. It's absolutely, it's the journey. Thank you.
Okay.
I'd like to invite somebody to join in with the conversation.
Who would you like, Kim? Tom? Maybe.
Yeah.
Tom?
Well, okay. Diane and I started out in the same explosion, this human potential explosion in California. And I was in my late 20s, and I had already left 3 PhD programs. I was very, very confused about what I was to do as an adult in the world. And my father loved me, but had given up on me. And, but I did go, I finally left it, the 3rd PhD program, and got into a PhD program in Santa Barbara. And that's where I met Diana, run by George Brown, who was a Gestalt therapist. And as part of my studies there, I also was trained in Gestalt. I read Roberto's book, the hardcover blue book that was printed in 1965. Because someone said, "You're interested in guided imagery, Tom, this will be useful to you." So I was reading Psychosynthesis, looking really just for about imagery and the work with imagery. I saw the egg diagram. I looked at it, I saw it, and I had an immediate apperception that this is what I've been looking for. It's a bit like the light with Diana and Roberto. It's hard to describe. It was like, this is it. This is it. This is what I have been looking for. And it was very, very interesting. There were 2 aspects to that response. One was this is what I've been looking for philosophically. And it was particularly that it included the spiritual dimension within a psychological framework. But the other voice said, and I could make a living on this, which I needed to do because by that time I was married and had one son and another one on the way. I needed to solve the practical problems of my life. So it was an epiphany. And from that moment on, I explored it, and my wife, Anne, also, we did this together, and we would actually drive from Santa Barbara to Redwood City for training programs with the 3-year-old in the back of the VW Bug, asking infinite questions about life, like when does time end and so forth. Our older son. And in one of we had very powerful experiences in these psychosynthesis workshops, which confirmed that this was the right place. And Anne was wonderful. She said, we have to do more of this. We have to do more of this. I was a little hesitant. Do I want to get into this? And she said, no, we have to. So we kept studying. And this led to, as the people in that institute in Redwood City were going to visit Roberto. So we were invited to go, and we, of course, wanted to go. Here was the problem. We had, by that time, we had a 4-year-old and a 9-month-old baby. So we couldn't leave him behind. I had a strong feeling, we both did, we need to go as a family. So we went as a family to Europe. Anne was still nursing Ben, and we flew to Paris, saw some friends there, took the overnight train to Florence, got out of the train station exhausted, and somehow got a cab to the institute. And we were sitting, and we just got inside the door of the institute, and we collapsed. We were just sitting there, the baby on my back, the 4-year-old, and exhausted. And this very tall, regal man called Victor in a black suit shows up, and he says, "Oh, you're here to see Dr. Assagioli." We said, "Oh my, yes, we are." So he ushered us right up to Roberto's study, and we came in, and there was Roberto in his velveteen smoking jacket, and sitting there smiling. And he stood up, and he looked at the children, and he said, "Oh, the children." And he was very cordial to us, but he clearly liked seeing the children, which was interesting. And he helped us find a place to stay, and we got settled. We found a babysitter in the train station just by asking people. This is the kind of thing you did in the 60s or early 70s. And we entrusted his babysitter to take our children into Florence every day for 2 months. Just, he put the baby on his back and go. And we didn't worry. It's unbelievable when you think about that now. And when we came in for the first time, Roberto greeted us and he said, "Where are the children?" And we sort of rolled our eyes. We're here, Roberto, for us, not our children. And he had read autobiographies that we had written, extensive autobiographies, which he marked. I know Piero and Diana know about these colored pencils that he would mark the papers with. We had an hour session with him. Each of us had a half an hour. And as you may know, he was deaf, so you recorded him by holding a microphone up to him so you could record what he was saying. And in that half hour, he said, he saw us so deeply that he was able to say to us very clearly what each of our life struggles were. And for me, it was, you have many talents, but your connection to yourself is not strong enough. You need to strengthen that connection. And he said just the opposite, which was interesting. He said, you know who you are. What your job is to manifest that in the world. And I can tell you, we're both in our 80s now, and we're still working on those things that he saw that first half hour. And when we walked out, we looked at each other and said, we could go home now. We didn't. We stayed for a couple of months. We saw him every 3 days or so. It was an extraordinary period of, I would call it, awakening to psychosynthesis, but also to ourselves. And there are many details, and of course, having the children there was marvelous. So glad we took them. But one other thing I want to say is, at the end of the time, it had been so meaningful to me that I said to Roberto, I said, when I go home, it's going to all disappear. I don't want to go home. I want to stay here. This is, this has been so important to me. And he looked at me and he said, my dear, all that you have experienced here vividly and fully, as you say, he quoted me, is in you. So you can't lose it. And it was such a marvelous thing to hand back to me, if you want to say, the power of my soul. This is all in you. You've discovered it here, but it's in you. And, he was very lovely. He gave me his blessing. He said, if there's anything I can do from afar, I will. And we went home, and that's how we got, Anne and I both together, and we're still both involved 50 years later with psychosynthesis, gratefully.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. Andrea, I'd love to invite you to bring your voice in now so that, Piero, you can round it up, this part.
I think my experience is quite different because you were looking for something. I was not. I was serving in the army because it was compulsory at that time in Italy. Luckily, I was serving in the sport team of the army, where I met a guy whose name is Piero Ferrucci. Was quite a bizarre guy. He was not joining the bunch of people I was hanging around. He stayed a lot by himself. He had rented a room outside so that he could meditate. So he said to me, you want to try? And I said, why not? Just out of curiosity. I was just on my way, quite determined to finish quickly my degree in law and becoming a judge. That was my vision. And I was very young, I was 21, but I was running fast. Then I met Piero, and the meditation was an experience like if you have never seen the ocean, if you've never seen a lake and you arrive and you see the ocean. No? And that was really exploring something I didn't know it was inside me and outside. So I became more and more interested, but I was finishing my army, my service. Piero had started later, so he came, I was completing my service before him. And before I was going to India, because my generation, as I usually say, either made the revolution or went to India, or both. But generally, there was a split between the two categories. So I wanted to go to India for no reason, if not for adventure. I was interested in adventure and curiosity. And after 15 months saying, yes, sir, I wanted to go my way. And before going to India, Piero said to me, oh, you can meet Assagioli. And I said, okay. But I had no, I did because I trusted Piero, because I thought it was an interesting friend, quite interesting and quite different from my usual friends. So I met Assagioli, and I had a very peaceful meeting. Even I was not used to meet old people. I had no grandparents alive when I was born. So for me, it was a very new situation to speak to someone who was 62 years older than me, in his 80s, no? Now we are getting close to Assagioli. We are becoming the same age, I hope so. So I went to India, then I came back. He wanted to know what happened. I had written awful novel about India, and they said, yes, I want to read. He never did, but it was kind of him saying that. And I began to visit him regularly, not knowing why I was doing that, except that I liked to be with him. That was the only reason. I had my plan. I said, oh, yes, it's a good idea. You could be a judge for minors, for young people. So it was not. And then sort of, you know, when the bike goes away, you don't really decide. You just change road. It was not dramatic. It was simple in a sense. Even me, I was substituting Piero in the summer because he was coming to the States. And so I came to Capolona, and it was not exactly the most sexy place for an holiday in the summer, in the summer for a boy 21, 22. But I was staying so well there. And I began to be less provincial, if you want. Because there was this meeting with those guys coming from the States, from England, from Holland, different places. And it was strange because in Italy, if you said psychosynthesis at that time, nobody knew. Very few. And if you said Assagioli, only old people knew that he was one of the first psychoanalysts in Italy. And Jung, correspondence with Freud, etc. But then I entered in this thing, and I never changed it. I dropped it. No, I completed my degree so that my parents could be a little more relaxed, even if they couldn't understand what I was doing. But I was liberal, let's say. They let me do what, and they saw that I was on my way, and so here I am. And I must say that, that will come later. Only once, I was really bored with psychosynthesis, with my life, with my relationships. It was 78, I think. And I went to India again. And Piero had given me the address of Lama Anagarika Govinda, great scholar of Tibetan Buddhism, who had met Assagioli. So I went to visit him, and I didn't want to mention anything of my studies and person. I wanted just to keep darshan, to stay silent, to listen to the people asking Lama Govinda questions. And then he turned his face to me and said, where do you come from? Florence. What you do? I do something named Psychosynthesis. He turned and he picked up from the bookshelf The Act of Will. Yeah, The Act of Will, and says to me, "That's a very important book. Go back and do Psychosynthesis." Like a kick back. So I said, "Okay, I can understand these big signals, not the subtle ones, but the big signals." And I'm very, very happy to continue. And now and then with Piero, we discuss what are we going to do the next 5 years. We just go on as long as then neural cells stays alive. We just go on. I like to see clients, to see patients. I prefer to call patients, to teach, and to expand a little the borders in other contexts, but that's something we can talk later.
Wonderful. Piero.
Well, when Tom was talking about Assagioli making red or blue signs with his pencil on whatever you brought to him, I remember a time when I had already been with Assagioli for a couple of years, and he would send me his students to do some preliminary sessions with me, and then I would tell him about that student with the student consent, of course. And so this man from America came and he brought an autobiography. Assagioli asked everybody to write their autobiography, and it was a 500-page autobiography. And so I said, but this is incredible. This guy is a narcissist. I can't read a 500-page autobiography. And Assagioli said, okay, give it to me, I'll read it. And that taught me something about being humble with clients and otherwise. But at that point, I had already bought into Psychosynthesis. In the beginning, I was not like Diana and Tom. I was not, I didn't have this instant seeing the light kind of meeting. And I was not trying to make the world a better place. I was more egocentric, I suppose. I was very interested in becoming enlightened. I was interested in meditation, Vedanta, Zen, and I had been also to America and spent some time in Esalen. It was like being massaged and turned upside down. It was very good. In fact, I heard about Assagioli in Esalen. And so I decided, well, maybe I'll go to Florence and meet this man. And I met him, but you must know that in Italy we have, especially in those times, we had quite a bit of a suspicion towards authority, especially older male authority figures. We had all the unrest in universities and so on and so on. So I was quite critical. And that, anyway, is the way I usually learn. And, here I come from Esalen, and there was the human potential movement and LSD and Gestalt and encounter groups. That's where it was at, that was the kind of stuff that blew your mind. And then I came to this man that was talking about sublimation of sexual energy. I didn't like that at all. And he was talking about, I have feelings, but I'm not my feelings. Whereas the whole Esalen mystique was about, as Diana said before, catharsis. The more catharsis you have, the better. People would just start a session and they were already cathartic. Catharsis was guaranteed. It was in the air. And so it seemed to me rather a restrained kind of method. And I had many doubts, and I challenged Assagioli on many counts. For instance, at some point, he told me, well, the lotus is a symbol of sublimation because it has the roots in the mud. And then the energy comes up and it creates a lotus. And I said, the mud. So you think that the body and the sexual energy is like the mud? And he said, yes, but I think the mud is a very good and nourishing thing. And so I think you have a bit of a complex, he told me, about the body and sexuality, because you thought mud was bad and dirty, and instead it's exactly what makes the flower open and grow. And well, I will tell you another memory. When I was at working with him in Florence, my aunt, Laura Huxley, which, as you may know, was deeply involved with all kinds of therapies and including psychedelics, came to visit me. And she had known Assagioli, she had met Assagioli years before. And when she came, she said, I have a little present for you. This is the kind of aunt that I had. And she took out a little pink pill, and that was pure Sandoz LSD. It was a very small dosage, though. It was dosage 50 milligrams. It was the kind of dose you can take safely and go for a walk. So we took it and we went for a walk in Florence. And a few things happened. And that was it. And then the next day I went to Assagioli. And Assagioli behaved in a funny way. I hadn't told him about this trip. I told him that in a year before I had taken LSD, but he instantly looked at me, and I could see that he was looking all around me. He was looking at my aura, and so I understood that taking LSD had done something to my aura. And the moment he saw that I saw, he stopped looking, and then he started again a little while after. And then weeks later, I asked him, "But do you read auras?" And he gave me a funny answer. He said, "Oh, I would never do that. I wouldn't be that indiscreet," which I don't know, made me think that maybe he did read auras. But I don't want you to believe that he was kind of a guru that made prodigies and did all kind of weird and spectacular things. In a way, he was spectacular, but in a more inner way, because when you were around, I had to overcome many resistances, and but then I saw what was happening. I saw that I was changing. I was changing deeply, much more deeply than I ever thought. And so I decided to stay on in Florence. And at that point, the excellent people came to visit him. Esselen represented what was called the human potential movement in those times, represented the far out aspect of psychology. And the visit from the Esselen people, I think, was a game changer for Assagioli, because they made him known, and people come from abroad started streaming in, young students. And they came, there were people who were in a spiritual search. And I could see them walking in. I was working as an assistant for Assagioli, so I would see people walking in and, having a private session with him, and then coming out. I could see that they were quite different when they were coming out. And the most common experience was that you walk in and you have a problem, and you walk out and you're still conscious of what you call the problem, but it's not a problem. It's kind of irrelevant from that kind of perspective. He was able to provide that alchemy that would change your
I think
your point of view,
unfortunately
your
Piero's
perspective.
connection.
What's that? Okay. Well, so I asked him, but how do you do this? I can see that people are going in and coming out in a different way. How do you do this magic? And she said, it's not a magic. Anybody can do it. You can do it. And it's just two things you have to remember. One, perceive the person in front of you as a self, as a soul. That is, look at the beauty, the inner beauty of that person. And second, remember always to radiate, to Assagioli saw radiation as an integral part of meditation. After you meditate, you don't keep that stuff for yourself, but you radiate it out into space to other people, to the world out there. And I'm certainly not doing. I'm certainly not as good as Assagioli was in doing therapy. Very far from it. But I think the two suggestions were very good, very appropriate.
I think, Piero, you speaking into, sorry, my internet connection just went down. And gratefully, when I arrived back, everyone was still here. I had a fear that you'd all be kicked out, but fortunately not. Piero, it's fascinating. I think you're talking into the next piece, really. But I wanted to do a little summary. So from these early beginnings of the human potential movement of these wild times, as you describe them, they make me smile, where for many of you, like Diana and Tom, it was an instant something happened, and yet that's not true for all of you. So Andrea, you joined because you trusted Piero, and Piero, against your better judgment, something seemed to settle in you. And what you're now speaking into, Piero, is something about, so if I'm looking at timing, we've got about 20 minutes for this, something about what's kept you in psychosynthesis over these decades. What is that compelling thing? And maybe you want to continue on and then pass on to somebody else, or join in together.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah. The thing I would say, and this is moving to in the sense the second question, it has to do, for me, I've done many different things in psychosynthesis, training professionals, starting institutes, teaching in different countries, so forth and so on. But the thing that's held me here for the 50 years is the beauty of the being, of the soul. And so I love so much, Piero, what you said about see the soul. To me, that is the core of the practice, and one of the things that is most easily lost. And yet, when the process of psychosynthesis is working, the beauty of the soul emerges, and it can be seen and supported. So I would say there are two beauties. The beauty of the soul has kept me here. And then the other thing, which in some ways is even, to me, more miraculous, is that he posited this process, psychosynthesis with a small p, building on what early humanistic psychologists talked about, self-actualization, Jung individuation, and so forth. But he basically said, look, this completely natural process of maturation, integration, synthesis is going on 24/7 in you, in your experience. And it is guided by the soul. And I think the fact that he was able to rest his practice on such a radical idea, that there was a completely natural, innate process toward maturation and full psychospiritual development that was in work in people all the time. That was fabulous. And I've always kept that right at the foreground of how I work with people, how I work with groups, how I think about psychosynthesis. To me, that's a huge, huge gift. And again, it's something it's hard to take seriously because we live in cultures that are much more make it happen, plan, be directive, so forth. This has nothing to do with that. This has to do with cooperating with a deep, inherently natural and beautiful process. And the things that have kept me here for 50 years are those moments when someone is in touch with that process within him or herself. It doesn't make any difference what the content is. It can be very painful, it can be very beautiful. And you see the beauty, not only of the person, but the process that's at work at them. To me, that's the touchstone of why I've stayed here.
It's interesting, Tom, because I think we'd all have something, articulate that in a different way, but we're all pointing in the same direction. Because how I would frame that, which is similar, I think, is that with Assagioli, I learned how to see potential. I mean, and when you said see the soul, when you were with Assagioli, there was no question about who you were. You rose to be the best version of yourself, if we want to call it that, or I transcended all the stuff that was going on. Of course, it had to be dealt with later, but there was something about when we see soul, people have the opportunity to transform. And having that experience of it is what kept me in psychosynthesis. And other things like no dogma, no doctrine, no belief system, purely based on whether things resonate with your experience or not. So the freedom that came with psychosynthesis and with Assagioli was just so open to allowing whatever was there to be there. I could say more, but I want to give space for Piero and Andrea.
Well, for me, I can tell you that I was afraid of being caught in a school, caught within the boundaries of a school or a cult or anything that would in some way make me less free. And so one day I asked Assagioli, I would love to keep doing psychosynthesis, and collaborate, but I want to make sure, is psychosynthesis open and compatible to all forms of art, to all scientific evidence, and to all spiritual traditions? And Assagioli thought for a moment, and he said, he looked at me in the eyes and then said, yes. And so that was the defining moment, because I could be in a school or movement, as he preferred to consider psychosynthesis, and still be open to everything that I wanted. On top of that, psychosynthesis is also the only school I know that gives you the tool for transcending itself. because transcending your beliefs. Because when you say, I have thoughts, but I am not my thoughts, you are already free. If you're really practicing that, you're already free of all your convictions. You go to a place where there are no convictions anymore. You're not the psychosynthesis, or you're not this, or you're not that. You just are. And to me, that's invaluable.
As a matter of fact, my experience is that I was lucky enough to work in different cultures with psychosynthesis. Would have been Indonesia or India or South America, and it's going on. And the model is so flexible, and it's important not to stick to the words, because, for instance, the words spiritual, to me, it was very annoying, because living in a Catholic little provincial town with 95 churches, everything that sounded like, and a small town, everything that sounded church-like was something that put me aside. But what I have seen, that I can speak of Atmana if I work with Indians, I can speak of Shunyata if we are in a Buddhist country, I can speak of existential values, no, in a lay way, not even referring to any other dimension. No, what is, that's a question that I do to my patients. What is really important for you? What is something you cannot negotiate, no? To arrive to deep values. That's what's very interesting for me. So as all of you are saying, there was a lot of freedom. There was not to stick to a model. There was not an orthodoxy. And whatever you say to Assagioli, he would say, me too. I said to him, I'm socialist, trying to provocate. And he said, me too. And then I said to Piero, and Piero said, oh, you always do that. You could have said communist, maybe not fascist, considering his personal life story. But there was this openness. And there was this, now we speak a lot today of the starting human potential. There you could touch the idea of the human potential, even because he was so old that he was in a rush. So he put people in the arena working with people very early. I would never do with my students something like he did. And he did mistakes as well. Let's be clear about that. Otherwise, we create an idol, a little church, and Guru Assagioli. That would be the best mistake to do about psychosynthesis. And it exists because identification can find every place. No? We can be identified with psychosynthesis in a rigid, dogmatic way. So what I think I really learned is this degree of freedom, this permission to experiment and to go around and to have experiences and then go back and utilize that. And I think that maybe Piero said something about that. It's a sort of, we can go beyond the word. What is important is what we do. Then we have an identity and history, and that's fine. But it's not an identification. Otherwise, we are in the same old problem.
Absolutely.
You know, I was thinking about that same period because it's true that that freedom was there, but there certainly were in our generation, and maybe still, orthodoxies that sprang up, and conflicts and criticism of other schools of psychosynthesis, competitive a competition between centers. And I think that maybe the thing is to say that it's an ongoing practice to keep disidentifying from psychosynthesis and recognizing it as the freedom-giving discipline that it is. But certainly we have, in our generation anyway, and I see some of it still, pretty critical claims about orthodoxy and what is psychosynthesis and what it isn't. You know, Sam Keen interviewed Roberto about psychosynthesis, and he said, what's the limitation of psychosynthesis? And Roberto said, limitation of psychosynthesis is that it has no limitation. And that was such a, Sam Keen, who was a very critical person, gave him an A+ on that answer. So I think we, and this goes into the third thing, we can come back to it, but I think it's important to watch for those orthodox tendencies and to make sure that there really is true collaboration and differentiation between the many, many, many different ways in which this very broad and deep discipline can be applied and used.
Yeah, and also I think there's a lot of people in the room, from the faces I see, have also been on the psychosynthesis road quite a long time. And from the 70s to now, you know, now we're talking about non-dual psychosynthesis. But in the early years, because people were so much looking for meaning and purpose, there was an over-identification in the psychosynthesis community worldwide with transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
And all the higher sidetracking issues that we all know about that come with an identification with transcendence. And what I've seen over the years is this grounding and this evolution of kind of recognizing immanence, kind of recognizing soul. Well, as Roberto said, we need to learn to be souls on earth. So we've gone through an evolutionary process as well. And the psychosynthesis that I teach today is so much better than the psychosynthesis I taught when I was 25 years old. It has moved on, and I think that would be totally congruent with what Assagioli wanted. And, you know, I live in the Findhorn community in the Scottish Highlands, and psychosynthesis isn't very foreground there, but I see psychosynthesis in everything they do. They just don't call it psychosynthesis. And I just don't call it psychosynthesis either, because what I've seen are so many universal principles that many traditions plug into, and psychosynthesis plugs into them as well, but it's not psychosynthesis. It's something archetypal or bigger than that. It's something more universal. So.
You know, when Andrea was talking about Assagioli saying "me too" to people, well, what are you doing? Oh, me too, I'm doing the same thing. I remembered again my aunt Laura when she went to visit him the first time, and her name was Archera at that time, and he said, well, Miss Archera, what are you doing? And she said, she liked to provoke people, and she said, I help people get rid of their garbage. And he said, me too, we do the same thing. And because he always tried to immediately find what he had in common with you. And I think his books are full of wisdom, but they're quite different from what he was. It's a wisdom that you find when you go back to them, you read them, and you, here and there you can find a phrase that you hadn't understood fully maybe before. But when you worked with him, and that is another thing that it took me many years to appreciate, is how much importance he gave to relationships here and now with people. That's why he wanted to see your children, Tom and Anne. I've seen Anne also. And because he was interested in people, he was a people person. And when my mother came to visit me in Florence, he told me that he wanted to see her, to meet her. And I found that sort of strange and embarrassing. And but he met her, and they had a great time together because he cared that everybody had good relationships. That was the base. If you don't have that, you cannot do anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So what now, Kim? You tell us what to do.
I was hoping Andrea would add something to what's being shared. Andrea, have I put you on the spot?
The fact that there was a lot of well-being staying there. So it was very easy for me to change totally direction in life, not in a dramatic way, because I like it to stay there. Not thinking too much, not making too many questions about it, and let's see what it will happen. But then afterwards, I was sort of sympathizing with Tom when he said at the start, "Oh, I could earn a living out of it." and when Assagioli was 23, he said, you could start to see people. And I thought the guy is out of his mind and is old. And then I began to see people. So this is not so important in itself. It gave me the idea that it was seeing something more than I could see. There is a fact that I told sometime. Once I went to visit him, and he had cut from the newspaper a sort of possibility to teach in the school. And in reality, I couldn't teach at that moment with the qualification I had at the moment. But I appreciated, of course, the fact that he was thinking of me and giving me an hint. Well, 1 year later, for a series of circumstances very bizarre, I began to teach psychology in an high school experimental lyceum, which I did for 20 years with such a pleasure, such a joy. And being an experimental school, I could bring in psychosynthesis in the afternoon. I could do the programs. So I was going back to him because he was very interested in education. So I thought that's probably something that I have to do. Not only the therapeutic work, but something in education. And so I've worked since then in the field. So sometimes I had the impression that he could see farther than me, and I could give a try to the possibility was opening. On the other hand, I was absolutely uninterested to work in the world of law at 10-11. So in a sense, it was easy to go on. And the value to me is the fact that it works in different times, in different cultures. That's so interesting. So interesting, because if we took those two little models, Assagioli does two models in all his life. The ovoid, I don't like to call the egg, the ovoid and the star of functions. And those models are so rich to work with, both in therapy, in education, in organizational work, and so on. That gives me the sense that we must push further on psychosynthesis, of course. No, otherwise we betray our teacher.
Andrea, that's a wonderful segue into the next question, but I think, Tom, you wanted to say something?
Well, yeah, I just to just hearing what Andrea is saying and what Piero said too about the aura. I mean, I think Roberto had a remarkable gift of seeing, let's just put it that he could see many things that were going on at many levels. The beauty was that he offset that power with humility. And also with what Piero said is so beautiful, that I think the relationship came first and everything followed from that. And there's actually a videotape that Everett Loomis did, an interview with him shortly before he died, where he asked him about psychosynthesis. And Roberto was crystal clear that you start with where the patient is. And for one person, one thing, and for another, quite the opposite. So he had this incredible gift, and yet he was very pragmatic is not the right word, but very grounded. And there's a story about a young man, one of those Californians like I was, it wasn't me, who came over and was meeting with him. And he said, Dr. Assagioli, your work is so important. It's just so important. And Roberto stopped him and said, the work is good. The work is useful, but important it is not. And I think he was deeply humble. Another thing he said to me, actually, he said, I could have used more ambition. He wasn't ambitious in the usual, Western way, but he was deeply humble and at the same time, deeply connected. So as Piero said and other people said, you walk in there and things begin to happen. Anyway, I just wanted to add that.
Wonderful, wonderful. We've got a third question for the four of you. And before we come to questions and answers, and the fourth question is about where we are now in our current context, and what is the emerging potential of psychosynthesis, taking into account that the world has changed dramatically over the last 50 years, that we are in a current paradox, chaos. There's so much going on in this constant state of change that is difficult. And I'm going to fold in one of the questions that have already come in. So this is quite a big question now. What would Assagioli say about life, the state of the world at the moment? So who would like to start with that one?
I think he would definitely see things as they are and be willing to name them, be willing to say how bad things are. But in the same breath, at the same time, I think he would say, go forth and serve. Go forth and serve. And, when we talk about the world today, what really comes up for me is where I've taken psychosynthesis, which I think, probably everyone here would agree that psychosynthesis could be a wonderful force in the world today for lifting people's spirits, for bringing more meaning, for all the things we know that we've experienced. And 20 years ago, after being in the trust for 20 years, I wanted to try to apply psychosynthesis with people who had never come to the pristine world of counseling or therapy. And so I decided to do what I didn't know what it was, and I still don't know what it is, social psychosynthesis. And I know that it's the application of psychosynthesis, but it's not teaching psychosynthesis, it's being psychosynthesis, it's relational. And so I started a program that works with socially excluded, disengaged young people who've gone off the rails. And I use a vision of Piero's aunt, Laura Huxley, of taking these really disengaged kids into nurseries and each young person having a vulnerable small child to become a mentor to. That's psychosynthesis to me. You know, it doesn't look like it. We don't use the words. We don't teach the kids psychosynthesis, but it's through the role modeling, the relational dynamics, the way of being, that is a gift that opens the door for young people to begin to believe in themselves again and begin to aspire for more in life. And to me, that's, I'm taking probably too much time to share this with you, but that to me is how I would see psychosynthesis going into the world today, not just through therapy, not just through counseling, but through relational dynamics on all the different levels. And Assagioli wrote about the psychosynthesis of the family, psychosynthesis of nations, psychosynthesis of our society, of groups, of organizations. So the application of that can be very, very broad in today's world. I don't know what Tom and Piero would say.
Oh, definitely. The only time perhaps when I saw Assagioli in just a very few seconds, but I saw him in a state of anguish, was when he spoke about Israel. At the time, Israel had been, this was 73, Israel had been invaded by Syria, and he cared a lot about Israel. There was this look of anguish, and he couldn't stand the idea of war, of having enemies, of not being in peace. And I think that he was very much into the books of Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard de Chardin had predicted that there would be a noosphere, that is, that the whole planet would build its own nervous system, so to speak, and become one from the mental and psychological point of view, that each cell would communicate with every one else. What I'm thinking about now, the internet, I think he would, it's always tricky to say what somebody would have said, especially with Assagioli, because he always said something different from what you expected him to say. He would always surprise you, but I think he would be fascinated by this process of the world becoming one. And now there are several studies that show that people who think in terms of being part of a greater whole instead of just thinking themselves as an individual are healthier and happier. And I think that's deeply significant, because everything that is happening in the world at this time points in that direction. We are much closer to each other right now, to people even that are very far away. We can experience much more than before that their destiny is also our destiny. And I think that is one direction that we will go anyway, even if we don't want to. And the other direction, this is you may think is less important, but maybe not. When this COVID business started, I had always refused to do sessions online. And then in Italy, the lockdown was very severe. We couldn't get out of the house. I started giving sessions. I had to give sessions online. And it was quite a discovery. We all had to adapt to these new media. And if you think about how this technology will be in 10 or 20 years, you will probably have virtual students and patients and clients in your study, and you have them you have them three-dimensional right there. Right now we are still in the beginning of this technology, and we start every time like, can you hear me? No, I cannot see you, all that kind of stuff that happens to everybody. But I think in a little while it would be much more effective and real and part of our lives in a way that is hair-raising and dazzling, because it already is a big part of our lives, and we'll have to adapt to that, and we'll have to adapt our techniques to that, and we'll see how we deal with it.
Piero, I often think about a talk that you gave at the Trust about 10 years ago about the philosophers of old sitting on the Parthenon steps, discussing this new thing that had come in writing and how it would change our lives. And as we went through COVID, your story came back to me quite a bit, because this is groundbreaking time. We're here together with people across the globe in a way that we've just not experienced before.
That's right.
I think we probably would all agree that with COVID, there was a great opportunity. There is a great opportunity for us to do it differently. And to me, the whole global situation with how we're not doing that, how we're not using the experience of COVID to really celebrate our interconnectedness and to really understand that we need each other so much and we have so much to contribute to each other. And the shadow is just as strong. And to me, it's just all bigger collectively, the global situation that I think psychosynthesis we could kind of roll up our sleeves and step by step work through. But it's a big task what's happening in the world today. And the shadow, in my opinion, is as big as the light right now.
I think that we must remember that Assagioli has lived at times as difficult as those that we are living.
Good point.
He was in the start of the, as they call, the short century. World War, he was an officer, empire declining, Einstein, Marx, everything changed in 20 years. Everything changed in 20. And with the risk of famine, let's remember that after the First World War, people was literally starving and dying for that. So he has lived that. And what he has done has worked silently and patiently. Mm-hmm. That's the point. That's the point that we can do. A point which is interesting in what Diana was saying to me is even to try to think in terms of one of the most ignored aspects when we teach, the point 7, the collective unconscious, and the different levels of collective unconscious. Assagioli said once to me, "Oh, Jung has made a lot of confusion about collective unconscious." Sorry for the Jungians in the room. But what I think is that really what we have to do is to work with a big frame, because what has collapsed totally is the idea of permanence, stability, and progress. Because the new generation has less possibilities than we had. Everything is unstable. People drop different situation because they don't know where to go. So it's a time extremely dangerous and extremely interesting at the same time. If we surf this wave trying to bring in the therapy room, in the schools, with teenagers, with prisoners in jail, so to go outside, no? It's okay, it's important to see people, but it's important to go outside and to try to be part of a larger thing. Now we know we have the risk to be always with middle class, intellectually graduated teachers. We have to go in the road. We have to go to work in a prison and see what happens.
Well, I think probably people in this room are doing that. I remember a trainee who was working in a prison. I remember another student who was working with sexual offenders using psychosynthesis. So I think generations are doing that, which is wonderful.
One of the things in relation to this question that I was thought about is that in some ways, there are two aspects or related aspects to Roberto's work. And the one that most of us have spent our lives on is individual practice. And I would say, I've said this before, that our generation needed to come to a mature understanding of how to really include the soul in psychospiritual therapeutic work and educational work and so forth. And I think we have that now. So quite naturally, I think the focus of psychosynthesis can shift to what Diana was talking about, of social psychosynthesis. And I want to read something from Roberto from his book, which was there in 1965. He says, "We seem to sense that, whether we conceive it as a divine being or a cosmic energy, the spirit working upon and within all creation is shaping it into order, harmony, and beauty, uniting all things," then parentheses, and this is an important parentheses, "some willing, but the majority as yet blind and rebellious, with each other, uniting all beings with each other through links of love, achieving slowly and silently, but powerfully and irresistibly, the supreme synthesis." And I think he had, and what Diana was talking about too, is yes, there is the darkness now and the disintegration and the rebelliousness against an emerging planetary whole. And my sense is that he had an intuitive sense of that. And therefore, I think psychosynthesis might have a whole other half-life where it's kind of work that Diana's talking about, where it isn't necessarily focused on individual therapy, that is focused on institutional, social issues, political issues, economic issues, climate change issues. All the principles can be used, and all those areas have to be addressed if we're going to have a supreme synthesis at some point. He also talks about a new, I put it away now, but a new civilization, the emergence of a new civilization. And there are many visionaries now who are talking about the planet is in the midst of a huge psychospiritual crisis in which everything has to change in order for a new level of consciousness and living together to emerge. And I see psychosynthesis is suited to really make a significant contribution in the next 100 years. And it'll be up to you guys, you young people. We've worked 50 years in this field, and here we are, and we're sharing with you. And there's a whole other, I'm working with some students in Florida now who are in their 20s and early 30s. And I am almost the age that Roberto was when he worked with me when I was 31. And it's so heartening. It's so heartening. And I think psychosynthesis is even more relevant now, given how consciousness has grown over these 50 years, and there's still a huge amount to happen.
Yeah, there's something there.
Wish you luck.
Sorry, Tom?
I was wishing them luck. All the young people the 300 young people who were listening to us. We wish you luck.
He needed.
And we'll be with you. And, we're not going anywhere.
Yet.
Social psychosynthesis. The question is, what political party does psychosynthesis belong? Or as a psychosynthesis, are you a leftist or a rightist or center? Are you politically committed? And I found an interesting answer in Assagioli's notes, which, by the way, they're all online. Anybody can read them. You should know this if you don't know it. Not only his notes, but also his unpublished writings now from today.
Oh, wow.
And what he wrote is one would believe that psychosynthesis is leftist because it is innovative and it's radical and it's revolutionary. So let's all be on the left side. But no, there is a good, we call it the psychosynthesis right. The people that feel that psychosynthesis is preserving the eternal values of the spirit. It's a matter of preservation, of keeping what's there, because otherwise we lose it. And I think that's equally true. But then somebody may come up and say, no, psychosynthesis obviously is in the center. And that's the third possibility. But basically, Assagioli thought that you choose your political preference from your history and from what you're doing at that time, and from how you've been educated and formed, and from your character too. But there is space for everybody, left, right, and center.
Piero, where can we find Assagioli's notes online?
You go to the Istituto di Psykosynthesi, the website, you find it easily. Then you find the Archivio, archive. You click on that, and you're asked, like in so many websites, you're asked for your name and password so that you can log in. It's very easy. And then you can make all the searches that you want. What did Assagioli say about gratitude? Let's say you just write gratitude and you click, and there will be, 20, 30, whatever time, little written notes. And now also typewritten documents. In English and in Italian, I would say more in English than in Italian.
Yes, and the two women in the Istituto have spent their lives building this library of Assagioli, and I've never met two more humble people when I was there and went to see them. And they've just dedicated their life. I know you've done a lot too with his notes, Piero, but these two women were so humble and so just dedicated and heartful in what they were doing and preserving, wanting to preserve Assagioli's teachings. It was very moving.
Well, it was a matter of scanning each little piece of paper that Assagioli ever wrote. So it took quite a lot of work.
And you might be happy to know, and I'm sure the three others of my colleagues do, that Assagioli would scribble a vision or an idea or a thought on a little piece of scrap of paper, because he always tore papers into A4 into 4 bits. And they'd scribble that, and then he'd kind of, and when I was working with me, he'd throw it in a drawer. And I'd come in the morning and say, okay, Roberto, what are we going to do today? And he'd say, well, let's sort out that drawer. So we'd spend at least 2 hours sorting out that drawer, cataloging them, blah, blah, blah. And I'd come back the next morning and the drawer would be exactly the same. And we'd spend the morning, some of the mornings, sorting out the drawer. And he had thoughts and visions and intuitions and ideas that were just everywhere. There was a sea of little scraps of paper. It's amazing, absolutely amazing.
There's a lot of questions that have been asked, as you would expect. Usually at the Trust, what we would do with something that's 2.5 hours long is we'd have a break. We're not having a break tonight, but this is recorded. So we've got just under half an hour left. And I've been making a note of the questions as we've gone along. I'm going to start with a couple of questions that have been asked by multiple people. And so the first question is by Karina, I hope I've pronounced your name right, and Christina, who are both interested in hearing what Assagioli would say about death and dying.
Well, I think that there is the last interview in which he is asked about what he thinks about death and dying. And he says in this interview, he says that he's old, but his organs are still good enough, and he hopes to have some more years to complete his work, but is not absolutely afraid about dying. And with a little provocation by the interviewer, who asked which is the belief system about the after death. And he says, well, I share with some billions of people the idea of reincarnation, but we'll see. So, and I was there even with Diana when Assagioli died. And there was a crisis, but I remember that at a certain point he said, against every catastrophe, I'm not yet dead. But then 15 days later, he died. And I don't have any special quote, special last wise sentence, just witnessing the fact that he was with his students from different parts of the world. I thought that that's a nice way to die, with your students around.
Well, I asked him, after you die, are you going to be around and follow us and maybe guide us from the other world? And he said, I don't know. Mm-hmm. So that was a mystery for him too, but I think he firmly felt, it was more than a belief, but felt the reality of the eternal. In fact, I'll tell you a little story about this. He had made the phrase, in the peace of the eternal, I rest and I restore myself. And he had written that in a little piece of paper. And 1 year, or actually months after his death, the secretary of the Istituto, who had become the president by that time, decided to send a Christmas greeting to everybody with that little note, in the peace of the eternal, I rest and I regenerate myself. And a few days after, a little old lady came up to the Istituto and she said, you know, Assagioli wrote me a postcard from the other world, and Apparently, he's doing very well.
Tom, did you want to add anything to death and dying?
Well, I was thinking, I had the experience after he died of continuing to feel connected to him. And I think I also interpreted what he said to me when I left. I give you my blessing, and if there's anything I can do from afar, I will do it. And then in the 80s, particularly, when I was working very closely to try to restore some of the damage that had been done in America, the psychosynthesis, he appeared to me in dreams and thanked me. And one wonderful, funny dream, which shows his sense of humor, it was on the cathedral steps, and he was standing higher on the cathedral steps than I was, and he was looking down at me, and he had a velveteen jacket on, and my mother had died by then. And my mother, who was really a wonderful woman, I would say my first spiritual teacher. And Roberto was thanking me for the work I was doing, and very warm appreciation. Then he said, "Oh, by the way, I just had lunch with your mother, and she told me to tell you that she remembers none of your accomplishments." And it was such a marvelous teaching coming through him. Now, where that's coming from is that Roberto, but it's just what I needed to hear, because I was deeply identified with trying to make things better, accomplishments, so forth and so on. And here was a reminder coming through Roberto from wherever, to lighten up a little bit. So I've had the sense of his presence ever since, not as vividly as the dreams, but still, I think he's around. Let's put it that way.
I just remembered another little story, which I'll tell you in a few words. I'm always worried about believing if somebody is sending me messages from the other world or whatever, and so I didn't have any messages or dreams from Assagioli, except once something very vivid happened when I met a woman that had met Assagioli for one session. And I met her almost by chance, and she told me that he has suggested to her to read the essay by Emerson titled "The Self-Reliance," in which Emerson says that the source of creativity is you, not others. You have to learn to rely on yourself. And that moment, I felt that was Assagioli's last teaching. I felt really that something was coming to me. And his teaching was, now you're on your own. Now you can decide best for yourself. It's a great essay. And Emerson was your neighbor, wasn't he, Tom?
Yeah, we lived in the same town, only 100 years apart. So he was very much still.
Diana, you wanted to share something.
Well, maybe we want to take another question, but I'll say quickly that Assagioli told me that when we talked about his wife's death, which was almost a year before to the day his death, I think, he talked about the liberation of death and how he looked forward to it and felt that there would be a smooth transition to another plane, were the words that he used. That's all. Go ahead, another question.
Thank you very much. I've got a brief question, or possibly not. I'd like to pick up on Jessica's question, which, Andrea, you spoke a bit about, because it fits in, Tom, with what you were saying as well, and Diana. Andrea, you spoke a bit about the mistakes Assagioli made. Could you share a little more about that?
Well, definitely. Sometimes I think partially because he was old and he was in a hurry and he needed people who could go on. So he has chosen some of his students that have done a lot of damages in the States, for instance, and that's one. And one thing that I noticed that when Assagioli died, there was a lot of splitting in the institute and conflicts coming up. I like to see that if there is not only the self of the institute, but even a personal I, a sort of, we say, the helper I, then things collapsed, and Piero was thrown away by the institute, for example, and other people. I want to remember Massimo, who should be with us today, Massimo Rosselli, and we are very angry with him for this. And so this gave me a sense that he was in a hurry to promote students to do things, and sometimes too much in a hurry. And so some people who have not cooked their personal seed, he was no more interested in the personal work of people. He couldn't waste time about what about your relation with your mama or with your girlfriend. He couldn't waste time for that. He generally sent people to Piero for this side. But doing that, it was looking very much, if you want, to the soul or to the spiritual potential, but he didn't look enough to some of the people he had chosen.
Andrea, if I can add to that, because that was what I saw. He got let down sometimes from people, and he saw potential. He related to the potential in an individual as if it were real, as if it had been actualized. And that's something I learned from him, and that's been really, really important to me in my work with other people, is that fierce determination to be with potential. And the shadow side of that is that you get let down, you get betrayed, the people that you've endowed are not actualizing that yet. And it can be pretty awesome, it can be pretty shocking sometimes.
And he knew it was coming, though. I remember him telling me, after me, the deluge.
Yeah.
So.
And in terms of what, as I said before, I think that we made a lot of mistakes in not paying close attention to the shadow, the personality, to the body, as integrated parts of the spiritual realization. And there was lots of premature transcendence in what Diana was talking about. I think that was the task of our generation, to sort out what really is a mature psychospirituality, or how can the force, the energies of the soul, be safely grounded and stored in a functional, expressive personality that, and be expressed in ways that are socially positive. And well, as I said, we made a lot of mistakes. We learned a lot too. And if there's a legacy that we're handing on to you, it's that. I think that there's a pretty good understanding of what Diana calls a non-dual, what I call experiential process by which the soul works, in which there are no splits. There's differentiation, but no split. And on that foundation, then I think psychosynthesis can continue to expand safely. But without that, we saw the trouble that we got in. And not everyone got out of it, but most of us did.
Tom, I think that goes in part to answering a question that Ben had about whether psychosynthesis works in groups, and it's this piece that you're talking to now, the four of you in different ways, about including the shadow and including the personality work.
Right.
But there's a couple of questions about diversity, so I'm going to group together some, and I'm just going to ask you to look at it in the way that you would like to. So the questions coming from the over 200 people that are here are somewhere around the world that we live in, the complexity and the nuance, the uniqueness, the understanding of the uniqueness of us all. And so about the gender, sexuality, the position that we hold in the world today with that, but also bringing in an understanding, this greater understanding that we have around neurodivergence and, I guess, the uniqueness of the soul. And the underlying question, I think, underneath that, from the perspective of people in the audience, is about what would Assagioli's take beyond this? I know it's a very big one.
So it's a wonderful question.
Mm.
Beautiful question. You know, I guess what comes to mind is I think the safeguard that allows the incredible diversity and differentiation of the human species to continue to happen, and the newest sphere to emerge, and for us to know that we are inevitably connected with each other, all those things that are emerging, is a completely assiduous attention to the present moment and the person's actual experience. I think as soon as you begin to create generalities, as soon as you begin to get, summarize this or say this is this and not that, you open your problems to prejudice, to abuse, to all the things that we've seen. So maybe that's an oversimple question, but it seems to me if we can teach people to know their experience, to trust it, and to express it without shame or guilt, and in their truth, if we can teach people to do that individually, in groups, in institutions, in countries, we will be able to find a new civilization. And it's, as Diana says, non-dual, it's experiential, it's not abstract, but it's real. And if people are rooted in their experience, they won't be fooled.
Yeah, it's also something that is very dear to my heart about psychosynthesis not having a normative chart on the wall that tells you what a healthy, fully functioning human being should be like. And that's the freedom that psychosynthesis has given me, that I can stay in it for so many years, that freedom of no normative chart. So what does that mean in terms of the question you're asking, Kim? I think it means no normative chart. I think it means freedom.
I want to underline that Assagioli was son of his culture and of his time. And so he wrote things that you wouldn't like to read about, for instance, the role of women. And then at one of the last interviews he gave to Servan Schreiber, he is totally in another place. So what I think is so interesting is to realize where we are conditioned by our century, by our culture, by our context, you know? And so to keep an inquisitive eye about that, you know? To keep some alert. And so I've seen him, if I read something that he wrote in the 30s and what he wrote in the 70s, it's incredibly different. on some topic. That's important. That's important because I think that the worst thing we can do Assagioli is to put him on an altar. He said, ipse dixit. That's a big mistake. And we tend eventually to do that because institutions tend to protect themselves. And that's always a risk to be aware of, my opinion.
Mm.
Well, I'll try to answer Kim's questions. I'm not sure I fully understood, but I'll try it anyway. And I want to say two very different things. One is about gender. As Andrea said, Assagioli wrote some things about gender which are incredibly embarrassing at this time and which are still circulating. However, at the end of his life, he jumped ahead and he suddenly became a futurist in my opinion, because what he said was very simple, was that each of us, before being man or woman, is a self, is a being. And there is a part of us that is neither man nor woman, but just is. And that is, and neither old nor young, is incredibly liberating. And the other thing I wanted to say, again, I don't know if it answers the question, but one unfinished, Assagioli left a lot of unfinished work that we have to develop, and it will take still many years for all of us, is the Psychosynthesis of the Nations, which is a fascinating subject. Each nation has a soul in this view. England has its soul, America has its soul, Italy has its soul, the Netherlands has its soul, and so on and so on. And what does that mean? It means that each nation, each people has contributed or will contribute to the rest of humanity by giving their souls or by giving their sub-personalities, because you can see nations as human beings in a way. And I think that it's a very tricky concept. Also because if you start talking about different people, different nations, you risk falling into stereotypes and jokes like a Frenchman, an Englishman, and an Italian man found themselves on a desert island, you know, that kind of joke. And however, I do think that there is, each country has a particular note, a particular gift or gifts that it can give to humankind. And that, to me, is the basis for peace. When we all understand that there cannot be war anymore.
Wow, thank you, Piero. We've got 5 very short minutes left, and I know that some people will need to leave on the dot of 8:30 UK time. I've got one question that I'd like to bring together, and so there's only room for about a minute for each of you, a rich minute. And the question is about the spiritual and the psychological, and how do they come together? What's the balance and what's the mix?
I take 10 seconds. I think it's a mistake to make a difference between the two.
Yes, I would agree with Andrea. I think what I'm learning is that the truth of the psychological is the spiritual at that moment in that person's experience. And there's nowhere else to go. The soul is there embedded in the actual psychological or physical experience, but it takes skill to know how to live with that, to transform it and so forth. And that's the non-dual, it's more a Buddhist perspective. So there is no differentiation. I think as soon as you split them like that, you have trouble.
Yeah, I would agree with that. No more to say.
Well, I would have to think about that, but it's the point here is what both Maslow and Assagioli were saying, and that is that the transpersonal or spiritual is not supernatural. It's natural. It's part of nature, like rain and the clouds and the sea and the animals and the human psyche and the self. That's all part of nature. You may believe in God or not believe in God, but the spiritual is part of nature. And that brings, I think, a completely different perspective.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Gosh, that's astonishing. So in summary, what a privilege to spend time with you. We had way over 300 people that signed up, and many people saying they would take the recording from today's this evening's session. Andrea, thank you so much for bringing Massimo into our celebration, really, of psychosynthesis. And for me, one of the resounding things, and I'd like each of you to say a sentence or so in closing, but one of the resounding things for me is the difference that you model about what psychosynthesis can look like. I have loved that you don't agree, that you don't have a homogeneous experience of psychosynthesis. And so if I hand it back to the four of you to make a sentence to close.
Well, the thing I wanted to say was to speak to the 200 of you or the 300 of you and encourage you in a couple of ways. Trust yourselves and keep going. Don't spend time thinking, there isn't a place for me in the world, there isn't work for me to do. See if you can come to a trust of yourself, and there's lots to be done. But the other is also stay in touch with each other and see yourselves see us as a huge community that's growing. And the way that grows, and it goes right back to Roberto and what Andrea said, or maybe Piero said it, about Roberto being relational. The relationship comes first. That's where the chemistry, the spiritual, psycho-spiritual work happens. So don't get separated from each other, even if you don't agree, even if you're in different countries, even if whatever. I think we have a real chance in psychosynthesis to grow a very powerful international global community that cares about each other and supports each other in each person's very different work. So luck is not the word, but I wish you well, and I'm not going anywhere.
Well, I think I'd like to say to you all that collectively, there's a soul of psychosynthesis, a being. And when each one of us as individuals are modeling, doing, speaking, embodying psychosynthesis, we have behind us the whole collective energy of psychosynthesis. And I've really taken heart in that over the years, that I'm not alone. And when I'm standing there doing something that scares the shit out of me, I just remember that I've got the collective, the being of psychosynthesis behind me, supporting me. And that's what Assagioli said to me when I left him the first time and went back, he said, "You will be helped." And that's what he meant for me.
Beautiful.
Well, I remember a time when Assagioli met a person from America, and they had a wonderful time together. And then Assagioli stood in his office, and this person stood at the door, and they saw each other and said goodbye by just going like this. And they kept going like this, and there was such an energy going between them. There was so much joy, you know. And then at some point, I don't know if you can see me, but Assagioli started going, and the other guy also went, and it looked a bit silly unless you knew what it was all about. And so, to you too.
No more words.
Go well, go well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Yeah. There's been such an amazing outpouring of gratitude, and I'm pretty sure that none of us are leaving this meeting not having our hearts warmed in some way.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah. We'll be publishing a recording, and such gratitude for you know, the just the open-heartedness that you've shared yourselves tonight with us. Thank you. Thank you to everyone in our community, this whole Psychosynthesis and beyond community. I know that Eric from Stockholm would be joining me in rejoicing how this evening's gone. So